Welcome to episode 34 of Psychedelic Divas. I'm your host, Carla Detchen, and in this episode, I'm honoring one of the most important teachers of my psychedelic journey, Rowena Ricci Coddington, my mentor, sister, guide, elder. She passed on March 30th at the age of 93, and both her life and her passing were a blessing. She was complete with a beautiful, soul-filled life, and her body was done. I first met Ricci through my teacher, Ralph Metzner. Now, I've spoken about Ralph before on the podcast, but for those of you who don't know, Ralph was an early pioneer of psychedelic research at Harvard in the early 60s, and he worked alongside Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass. As I've said, Ralph was one of my most important teachers, and I worked with him over the course of 22 years. But after one of our sessions in 1996, he asked me what I was looking for next. And I said, well, what do you got? He offered me a couple of options. The first was a connection to Starhawk, the renowned witch, activist, author, who was at the center of feminist spirituality. And that would have been very cool. But then Ralph mentioned that he knew a woman who was creating a psychedelic women's group. And I just knew immediately that was my path. I joined Ricci's women's group the following year in 1997. Now, this was back in the deep, dark underground days, so this connection was super special. This was not a group you could Google because A, Google didn't exist yet, and B, this is not the kind of group that would ever have been advertised anywhere beyond select word of mouth. This was an invitation-only, deeply sacred circle of women doing medicine work together. We met 4 times in 1997 and 4 times in 1998. Each long weekend was a slow, relaxed, deep dive into sisterhood and community. Ricci held impeccable group space. The container was held by loving sitters. The energy was always solid. And if something did go wrong, and sometimes it did, you could trust it would be handled. Everything was about beauty and comfort. The music she played in ceremony was extraordinary. And this was well before iTunes and Spotify. We're talking mixtapes and eventually burned CDs that were beautifully curated, pulling from cultures and traditions from around the world. Ricci knew that women were the caretakers out in the world, so these weekends were devoted to self-care. Delicious food, no early morning timelines. Massages were an added option. It was all about being nurtured and supported. Ricci varied the medicines we used, including MDMA, LSD, mushrooms, mescaline, harmaline, and ayahuasca. Of course, the medicine time held so much learning. But the real learning, teaching, and healing was in the community of sisters. Our second year together, some dear sisters left and new dear sisters flowed in. Ricci had an impeccable sense of who would fit. Some of these sisters I still know today. Others have passed, and others have drifted away. But what remains is the learning that it's powerful and deep when women gather in circle. We show up differently. We heal together. Sometimes that's what the circle is about. Healing the sister wounds, tending the mother wounds. And sometimes, unfortunately, we add to that wounding. Not on purpose, but because we're still working those wounds out. And in that way, we became each other's teachers. We were set to continue the group into 1999, and then Terence McKenna got sick. For those of you who don't know, Terence was one of the most influential voices in the psychedelic world. A philosopher, ethnobotanist. He was a visionary whose work helped shape the entire conversation around plant medicine. He was a dear friend and colleague of Ricci and her husband Jack. When he got his cancer diagnosis, they dropped their world to help tend to him, and he died in their home in California. That's who Jack and Ricci were. The kind of people you called when things got hard. So while our circle ended that year, what Ricci had given us was enough to last a lifetime. So let me tell you a little bit about who Ricci was. She was an African-American woman working in the psychedelic underground in its earliest days, in a world that was almost exclusively white, almost exclusively male. There was Ricci. Black, brilliant, warm, hilarious, holding sacred space for people whose names you would absolutely recognize. She was a rarity, an absolute treasure. She embodied a quiet grace and deep wisdom that's hard to describe. Her lineage was extraordinary. She trained with Leo Zeff, the legendary underground therapist, who's the subject of the book, The Secret Chief. And if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. Leo was one of the great heroes of psychedelic therapy. He trained hundreds of guides in the art of holding space. She also learned from Fritz Perls, the German-born psychiatrist who founded Gestalt therapy. Fritz spent his final years at Esalen in Big Sur, where his live demonstrations drew therapists from around the world. She also worked with Jack Downing, one of the leading Gestalt trainers in the country, who had introduced LSD therapy for alcoholics in the early 60s, before it was illegal. Jack was on the leading edge of what was possible when you combined depth psychology with altered states. Jack and Ricci became such dear friends that Ricci was also at his bedside as he died. Jack was the one who recommended office space to her in the same building where Leo worked. In 1960, Leo invited Ricci to what she thought was a meditation workshop, but turned out to be an ibogaine ceremony. When I saw Ricci in February, she said that those experiences saved her from a very difficult time in her life. Specifically, she said, "Ibogaine saved my life." Ricci also learned from Oscar Ichazo, who founded the Eureka Institute, which became Ricci's spiritual home. Eureka has been described as a body of techniques for cosmic consciousness raising and an ideology to relate to the world in an awakened way. And I would say that also describes Ricci and her work in the world. Ricci sat at the intersection of all of this. She didn't just inherit a lineage. She lived it, embodied it, wove it into something entirely her own. Later, her husband Jack became her partner in all of this. Together, they were a force. Two eclectic, worldly, deeply spiritual people who gathered wisdom from every corner of the planet and brought it into their work, their home, and their community. In 2000, Jack and Ricci took a group of us to Peru to do ayahuasca in the jungle. Now, I know that today doing ayahuasca in Central or South America is fairly trendy, but in 2000, nobody in my world was doing this. Ayahuasca tourism did not exist yet. There was no app, there was no retreat directory, no Instagram account full of jungle photos and glowing testimonials. This was early days. This was deeply hidden, deeply confidential, deeply sacred. You didn't talk about it. You didn't post about it because there wasn't any place to post. Jack and Ricci had curated a wonderful group, and I knew almost everyone on that trip, which made it even more magical. Getting to the retreat was itself an initiation. We traveled by car to Pucallpa, then by boat for hours along the river, and then finally we walked into the camp through the jungle, carrying our bags. By the time we arrived, the world we came from felt very far away. And that was the point. The retreat was deep in the Amazon jungle, rustic, basic, alive with plants, animals, and spirit energies. We each had our own tiny open-air casita tucked into the jungle, close enough to be in community, far enough apart that you had your own solitude, your own silence, your own communion with the jungle around you. And that included communion with all the amazing, creepy, massive bugs that rested on the screen of my mesh tent inches from my face as I used my headlamp to read at night. There was a central maloka, which is a large, circular, open, thatched ceremonial space where we would gather to drink the medicine together. Our curandero was Don Jose Campos, an experienced medicine man who at the time had been working with ayahuasca for 2 decades and who had studied with other master curanderos throughout South America. We were there for 10 days, and we drank ayahuasca 5 times in the jungle, and then 2 more times after leaving the jungle. What I learned in those journeys is its own episode, and that is what's coming next in episode 35. But what I want to say here is simply this. What a rare, once-in-a-lifetime gift Jack and Ricci gave us by creating that experience when they did. They were always ahead of the curve, always opening doors that most people didn't even know existed yet. One of my favorite things about Ricci goes to the heart of where she and I bonded. We were both troublemakers. Ricci was the troublemaker in the circles where she learned with Leo. I was the troublemaker in her women's circle and also in Ralph's. And when she figured that out, she didn't get irritated. She saw me. She honored that part of me. She knew exactly what I needed because it was the same thing she had needed in her younger days. And she met me there with warmth, understanding, and a wry sense of humor. One day in the women's group, we were working with a medicine that didn't last particularly long, and I started to surface before everyone else. Ricci came over and quietly asked if I wanted a booster. And I was happily surprised and said yes. She reached into her medicine bag and she started digging and unwrapping and digging some more and unwrapping some more. And it was taking forever. And we're both trying to be quiet because everyone else is still deep in their journey. And she's in there excavating like she's looking for buried treasure. And finally, she digs out the tiniest little orange nugget. It was 62.5 micrograms of LSD. And we both just cracked up, silently. We were giggling because it had taken her what felt like a year to find this thing. And also because she had just handed me something that was going to last for another 8 hours. She winked at me, and that wink said it all. I know you. I know what you need. You can handle this. And I could. I still remember that wink and that tiny orange nugget and Ricci's smile. I carry her medicine and her acceptance in me still. On a side note, I miss that LSD and wish I was still carrying that with me as well. It was always reliably the same, a tiny orange barrel the size of the head of a pin, 62.5 micrograms. It became my baseline, the thing I measure all LSD doses against in my body to this day. In the early 2000s, Jack and Ricci moved to the Big Island of Hawaii. And while I wanted to continue working with them, financially, I had to make choices about where I invested in my medicine work. And because of the particular style in which Ralph worked, I chose to continue with him. But Ricci and I never lost our sisterhood. I would see her at special events, in circles, in the spaces where the psychedelic community gathered. She was always warm, funny, present, with that same smiling light in her eyes. Around 2019, she called in her medicine sisters, her daughters, as she called us, for a retreat in Hawaii. We came together to share about our work, to learn from each other, to be in community. It was held at a beautiful house, and it was pure Ricci, creating the container, gathering the women, weaving the connections. That was her gift. That was her calling. She wove together an incredible tapestry of who she was, all her travels, all her teachers, all her wisdom, and then shared it out into the world for us to take in and then share. As they aged, Jack and Ricci eventually had to leave the Big Island and move to Oahu, to Lunalilo Home, an assisted living community. And here is something I want to say very clearly because it matters. So many of our psychedelic elders gave their lives to this work during decades when it was illegal, underground, and unsupported by any mainstream institution. They didn't build traditional retirement savings. They didn't have the financial safety nets that more conventional careers might have provided. They gave everything they had to the healing of others. And so when Jack and Ricci needed support, they were so beloved that the community showed up. A GoFundMe was created that was shared by people like Stan Groff and Jack Kornfeld. A nonprofit donation site was made available for larger donations. The Women's Visionary Congress contributed through their Elder Support Fund. The people whose lives had been touched by Jack and Ricci, even those who had never heard of them or worked with them, reached into their pockets and gave back several $100,000s. Ricci has now passed, but Jack is still with us, still a revered psychedelic elder, still in need of that support. And I'm going to put the GoFundMe link and other donation links in the show notes. And I'm asking you, if Ricci's stories moved you today, if you understand the value of what these pioneers gave us, please consider contributing. Ricci and Jack chose to remain deeply underground until the end. I begged her on multiple occasions to let me record her stories. Not even for the podcast, just for posterity. But she kindly said no. That old school commitment to staying hidden won out. Luckily, right at the end, months before she passed, she did do some recordings for the Women's Visionary Congress, so a little bit of her story was captured. In January of this year, I came out of a ceremony, and through a series of weirdly magical circumstances, I made the last-minute decision to go to Oahu again to see Jack and Ricci. I got there in February, just a month before she passed. I sat with both of them. I brought ice cream. We shared stories and memories. It was sweet and tender, and I knew that it would be the last time. She passed on March 30th. Ricci was a wisdom keeper, a truth sayer, a troublemaker in the best possible sense. She was a Black woman who showed up and held space in a time when that took a lot of courage. And she was able to meet you exactly where you were. And she did it with warmth and humor and a medicine bag full of surprises. I am who I am in large part because of her. And I know I am not alone in that. As the other sisters have gathered online to share memories of Ricci, one phrase that she taught has been repeated over and over. Trust the process. So I want to close this episode with a poem. I wrote this poem spontaneously. I don't write poems. It literally poured through me during a circle where Jack and Ricci were both present as participants. We were surrounded by other teachers and guides, many of whom have shaped my path. And it came out of nowhere, and I had to act fast to catch it. I borrowed a piece of paper and scribbled it down. It's called Raised by Bad Elders, and it's for Ricci, and for her husband Jack, and for Ralph, and for all the other bad elders who aren't ready to be named, who raised me and all of us into who we are. Raised by bad elders. My mother taught me the social graces, the debutante niceties, the way to navigate safely and ladylike in the world. My father taught me to be a rebel, but to stay within the safe confines, the restrictive boundaries of corporate jobs and white picket fences. My parents grew me up to be a polite, well-educated, white glove wearing, sorority joining, yacht club going, productive member of society. But they weren't who raised me. I was raised by bad elders. I was raised by the rebels, the rule breakers, the out-of-the-box, blow-up-the-box thinkers. I was raised by troublemakers, Molotov cocktail-throwing questioners of authority. I was raised by the kinds of voices that society tries to silence, calls dangerous. I was raised by wisdom keepers, truth sayers, visionaries and seekers. I was raised by the mad ones, willing to risk it all for the sake of inner knowing and deep spiritual truths. I was raised by the voices that have moved this country, this world, this universe forward. I was raised by elders who taught me to see, not with my two eyes, but with the power of my mind's eye. I was raised by elders who showed me who they were in all their ragged, honest vulnerability, which allowed me to learn and see and express my own inner truths. They helped me to vision and stand in my strength, my beauty, my flaws, my many, many flaws, my sweetness, and my not-so-kindness. They let me fall and pick myself back up again. They cheered, they supported, but they always let me do it on my own. I was raised by bad elders, and someday, God is willing, I hope to be one myself. Rest in power, Ricci. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being my sister. And thank you for listening. I put the donation links in the show notes. Thank you for helping to support Jack through the rest of his life. That means so much. With gratitude to Ricci and to the community she built and the teaching she shared. Thank you for being part of this learning journey with me. I so appreciate you.